Every day Dominic Wright wore his grief like a custom suit, pressed, silent and stitched with rules no one dared to break. A billionaire widower, a father to 18-month-old twins who hadn't laughed since the day they buried their mother. 6 nannies had tried, 6 had failed. But one grey afternoon, Dominic came home early. No warning, no driver, no reason really. And the moment he stepped inside, he heard something that didn't belong in a house like his. Laughter, not polite giggles. Laughter, loud, chaotic, real. He followed it, past the cold marble, past the untouched nursery, past the silence he'd spent months trying to preserve. And then he saw her. Doris, the maid he barely noticed, bathing his sons in the kitchen sink, sleeves rolled up, yellow gloves dripping, singing a lullaby like she'd sung it 100 times before. His sons were glowing, his chest tightened, his breath caught. Was this a boundary crossed? Or the beginning of something he wasn't ready to feel? Stay with us. This is a story about sorrow, softened by song, the woman who stepped into a silent home, and the man who never expected to need her. Dominic hadn't meant to come home. Not this early, not today. The meeting had been cancelled. His phone was still full of unread messages, his calendar overbooked as always. But instead of heading back to the office, he just drove. No calls, no music. Just him behind the wheel, windows sealed, thoughts screaming through the quiet. Outside, the clouds sat low over Bel Air, muted, heavy, the kind of sky that made even wealth look tired. When he pulled up to the estate, the house looked exactly as it had every day for the past 6 months. Too big, too perfect, too hollow. He stepped inside, dropped his keys in the bowl near the door, loosened his tie, expected nothing, and then, there it was, a sound that shouldn't have been there. At first he thought he imagined it. Then it came again, clearer this time. Laughter. His sons, Alan, Adrian, laughing. The sound hit him harder than it should have. They hadn't laughed like that since... He didn't finish the thought. Instead he followed it, quick unsteady steps through the hallway, toward the one room in the house where no one ever made noise. And then he stopped. He didn't walk into the scene, he crashed into it. Doris was kneeling by the sink, humming a soft tune that curled around the room like it belonged there. The twins were soaked and smiling, surrounded by bubbles and the kind of warmth you can't fake. She didn't see him at first. Her focus was on the babies, gentle, present, unfazed, and Dominic. Dominic was frozen. It was the first time in months he'd seen his children look at someone like they trusted her, and for a moment all he could feel was panic, not because they were in danger, but because they weren't. He cleared his throat, too loud. The briefcase slipped from his hand, hit the floor. Doris looked up, eyes wide, still kneeling. "I'm sorry, Mr. Wright," she said quickly. They were flushed. "I couldn't find the thermometer. I thought the bath might help." Her voice was even, careful, but not afraid. "You're the maid," he snapped. "You're here to clean, not to—" His voice broke off, because when he looked down at his sons, they weren't crying. They were calm, happy, home. And he realized, with the kind of clarity that stings, she hadn't stolen anything. She'd simply given them what he hadn't. That night he didn't fire her. He didn't thank her either. He just sat in his office, staring at the wall, hearing that gospel hum echo in his chest. And somewhere deep inside, something shifted. But before we begin, click subscribe, like this video, and tell us where in the world you're watching from. I hope this story reminds you that sometimes family finds us in the quietest ways. Dominic stood just past the kitchen threshold, breath locked behind his ribs, as if stepping any further would shatter the moment or confirm it was real. The twins, Alan and Adrian, sat knee to knee in a baby tub, their curls wet, cheeks glowing, bellies bouncing with laughter he hadn't heard since... He blinked hard. Didn't finish the thought. Doris didn't look up right away. Her sleeves were pushed to her elbows, yellow gloves abandoned on the counter. She dipped a soft cloth into the warm water, wrung it out, and gently ran it over Adrian's arms, humming a tune so soft it barely touched the air. The boys looked at her the way children look at comfort, natural, undoubting. And for a flicker of a second, Dominic hated her for it. Not because she had done something wrong, but because she had done something right, and he hadn't. His foot stepped forward without meaning to. The tile clicked under his shoe. Doris's head turned. She froze, eyes meeting his, voice still in her throat. She started, rising slowly. I didn't mean... He raised a hand, sharp and automatic. What do you think you're doing? They were flushed, she said, her voice steady. Crying. Restless. I thought they had fevers. I couldn't find the thermometer. I remembered warm baths help. You're the maid, he said, louder than necessary. You clean. That's it. She didn't flinch, just nodded once, controlled. Yes, sir. I know. Then, quietly, almost too soft to catch. But I couldn't just leave them like that. Dominic's jaw locked. He looked down at his sons, still laughing. Adrian splashed water toward Alan, who squealed in delight and splashed back. They were alive in a way they hadn't been in months. And she had done that, not him, not the grief counselors, not the parade of overpaid nannies. Her. He couldn't process the fury and shame mixing in his chest, so he did what he was best at, shut it down. Towel them off, take them upstairs, he said, backing out of the room. We'll talk after. She didn't argue, just nodded, lifted Alan gently, wrapped him in a soft towel, kissed his damp hair without thinking. That part, that kiss, made Dominic's throat tighten like a fist. He turned before he could say something he'd regret. He sat in his office, untouched scotch on the desk, the echo of laughter still reverberating somewhere in the back of his skull. It shouldn't have hit him this hard, but it did, because for the first time in half a year, his house hadn't felt like a waiting room for grief. It had felt, just for a breath, like a home, and that terrified him. Upstairs, Doris moved through the nursery like she'd done it before. She dressed the boys in fresh pajamas, laid them side by side in their cribs. Adrian fought sleep, babbling nonsense. Alan sucked on 2 fingers, eyes fluttering. She sat beside them, folded legs, hands resting in her lap. And then she sang, not loud, not for show, a soft old gospel lullaby, the kind passed down by memory, not sheet music, the kind you carry in your bones, even when the person who taught it to you is long gone. Down the hall, Dominic stood just outside the nursery door, back against the wall, eyes closed. He didn't mean to be there, didn't mean to listen. But he couldn't walk away. The song wasn't Lauren's. It didn't bring her back. It didn't try to. It was something else entirely, something steady, quiet, present. Inside the nursery, Alan yawned. Adrian shifted once. Then stillness. Dominic lingered, long after the song ended, long after Doris had slipped out of the room. He stared at the closed door like it might offer answers if he stared hard enough. Then he turned, walked to his own room, didn't sleep. The next morning, Doris moved through the house as if nothing had happened. She didn't ask about last night, didn't explain, didn't apologize. Dominic didn't speak to her either. But something in the house had shifted, barely noticeable at first. A beat skipped, a silence interrupted. At breakfast, Alan dropped a spoon and burst into laughter. Adrian followed. Dominic watched them, unmoving, then caught himself almost smiling. Almost. Later that day, he passed the laundry room. Doris was folding towels, not humming, not speaking. He paused, opened his mouth, but said nothing. She didn't look up. That night the boys fussed again, crying, warm to the touch. Dominic panicked. He paced the hallway with Adrian in his arms, helpless. Alan's cries echoed behind him. Then Doris appeared, no fear in her face, no hesitation. Warm compress, fluids, keep them upright, she said, already moving toward the kitchen. Dominic didn't argue. For the first time. He followed. Doris didn't sleep much that night. She didn't need to be told she'd crossed a line. She felt it in the quiet, in the way Mr. Wright had looked at her like he was trying to unsee something that had already taken root. So, in the softest hours of morning, she began to pack. Not everything, just the things that mattered. A worn photo tucked into her journal. A cardigan her brother Elijah used to borrow when he got cold. Her toothbrush, her silence. She moved like someone used to leaving before being asked to go. Downstairs, the kitchen had been scrubbed spotless by her own hands just hours ago, but it still smelled faintly of baby soap and gospel. Dominic sat at the breakfast table, untouched coffee cooling beside him. The twins had eaten already. Doris had fed them early. Their fevers had eased under compresses and rest. No thanks required. He didn't speak when she entered, didn't look up, but she could feel his mind turning. Still playing last night on repeat. She placed the clean bottles on the drying rack, wiped the counters once more, and turned to leave. "I saw you packing," he said without looking up. Her breath caught, just slightly. She paused in the doorway. "I figured it was time." He didn't answer. She waited. 1 second. 2. Then, "You were right," he said quietly. "They needed something. I didn't see it." Doris stayed still, not out of pride, but restraint. She'd learned long ago that some men don't speak truth until silence forces them to. Later that morning, she stood outside on the back porch, watching the twins play on a blanket in the sun. It wasn't much, just blocks, stuffed animals, and soft murmurs between them, but it felt like breathing again. She closed her eyes, let the warmth hit her face, and for a second, she allowed herself to remember. Elijah, laughing on a summer day, one sock on, the other always missing, his tiny fists full of crayons, his head warm with fever, but still smiling. She'd given up school to take care of him. Walked out of her nursing program halfway through, not because she couldn't finish, but because he had no one else. By the time she lost him, she had nothing left to go back to. But she still remembered what to do when a child's skin turned too warm, when their breath changed rhythm, when their cries thinned out into panic. That kind of knowing didn't come from books. It came from love and loss. Inside, Dominic stood by the nursery door, watching her through the window. She didn't know he was there. She looked peaceful, whole, as if this, the sun, the twins, the silence between moments, belonged to her in a way it never had to him. He hadn't asked her what her story was. He didn't even know where she was from. Just that she'd shown up after Lauren's funeral, hired through an agency. One of a rotating list of staff who came and went with contracts and background checks. But now standing there, watching her sit between his boys like she was meant to be there, he realized how little he knew about the person who had just calmed his entire household in a single night. That afternoon, Adrian started fussing again. Doris was folding laundry upstairs when she heard the sharp cry. She dropped the towel mid-fold and was moving before the sound had finished echoing. Dominic reached the room just a step behind her. She went straight to the crib, hand on Adrian's forehead. "Warm but not spiking," she murmured. "Could be teeth." He didn't interrupt. She lifted Adrian gently, held him close, bounced him with a rhythm that made his cries taper off into whimpers. Dominic watched again from just outside the frame, this time not as an intruder, just a man realizing that maybe she knew something he didn't. After the twins were settled again, Dominic walked into the laundry room. He wasn't looking for anything, but as he reached for a spare crib sheet, something slipped from between the folds. A photograph. Old, slightly faded. Doris, maybe 19. Smiling, arm around a boy in a wheelchair with a toothy grin and eyes that mirrored hers. He stared at it for a long time. Something unspoken rose in his chest. Guilt. Wonder. Maybe both. He didn't bring it up when he saw her later. Didn't ask. Instead, when she passed him in the hall, he said, "Want some tea?" Doris hesitated, then nodded. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't forgiveness. But it was something. That night, the twins settled earlier than usual. Doris sang from the nursery, low and steady, rocking side to side as if her feet remembered lullabies her mind had forgotten. Dominic lingered outside the door again, this time with a chair. He didn't sit. He just stood behind it, listening. Each note carried something different than Lauren's voice. Not better, not worse, just truer to this moment. Less about the past, more about now. He didn't know what this was, or what came next. But as Doris finished the song and stepped quietly from the room, he didn't move out of her way. They stood there inches apart, neither speaking. She didn't ask if he'd been listening, and he didn't pretend he hadn't. She gave him a soft nod as she passed, and for the first time in 6 months, he felt the weight in his chest shift, just enough to take a full breath. It was just past 2 a.m. when the crying started. Not the restless whimpers that came with bad dreams or teething. This was different, sharp, guttural, desperate. The kind of cry that made every hair on Dominic's neck stand up before he was even fully awake. He was down the hall in seconds. His bare feet hit the hardwood like gunshots. Adrian was burning up. His tiny body writhed against the crib mattress, cheeks flushed, breath shallow. Alan, in the next crib, was beginning to stir, face scrunched, small hands curled into fists. Dominic stood frozen. No thermometer, no idea what to do. The tips of his fingers tingled with panic, useless. Then, footsteps, light, quick. Doris, hair messy, cardigan thrown over her nightgown. She didn't ask for permission, just moved. She went to Adrian first, her hand to his forehead, then his chest, then to Alan, checking his pulse against her cheek. She looked at Dominic, calm but urgent. It's back. Both of them. Dominic swallowed hard. What do I do? Doris didn't hesitate. Strip them to their diapers. We need to lower their temp slowly, not cold water, just cool towels. Bring them downstairs. No argument. He moved instantly. No ego. Just a father with 2 burning children and a woman who somehow already knew exactly what came next. The kitchen lights flicked on like a stage. Doris laid clean towels on the counter, ran lukewarm water, cracked open the small box of electrolyte packets she always kept in the drawer, quietly for moments like this. She dampened 2 cloths and handed one to Dominic. Hold it under his arms, gently, not too long in one place. He did as she said. His hands trembled, not from weakness but from the realization that she was guiding him through a battlefield he'd never trained for. Between instructions, she moved fast, checking vitals, mixing fluid, rocking Alan against her chest while reaching for the thermometer she'd finally found wedged behind the soap tray. 102.7, she murmured. Climbing. Dominic looked at her, the question already in his eyes. How do you know all this? He asked. She didn't answer right away. Her eyes stayed on Adrian's face as she wiped the sweat from his brow with practiced tenderness. Then, my brother. She didn't need to say more, but she did anyway. Elijah had seizures, started around age 2. Every time he got a fever, it was like walking a tightrope. I learned what to do because no one else knew how. Her voice didn't break. It didn't need to. Dominic watched her in silence. Everything about her made sense now. The way she'd moved that first night, the way she watched the twins like they were stories she already knew the ending to. She didn't just care. She'd lived it. Time passed in fragments. Cool cloths, gentle words. A soft song under her breath, barely more than a hum. The boys began to settle, their chests rising slower, cries tapering into groggy murmurs, bodies limp with exhaustion, but not fear. Dominic sat on the floor beside the fridge, Adrian against his chest wrapped in a damp towel. His head rested back against the wall. His shirt was soaked. He hadn't even realized he was crying until Doris handed him a clean cloth and didn't say a word about it. He looked over at her. She was cradling Alan, rocking gently in the chair she'd pulled from the hallway. They didn't speak. There was nothing to say. Only the weight of 2 tiny bodies finally beginning to cool, and the warmth of a silence that no longer felt like grief. An hour later, both boys slept in the nursery, humidifiers on, fresh bottles nearby. Doris stood in the doorway, arms crossed, gaze fixed. Dominic lingered beside her, shoulders slumped, voice low. "I didn't know what to do." She glanced at him. "You weren't supposed to," she said. "Not alone." He let the words settle. Then, softer than he'd ever said anything to her before, "Why didn't you ever tell me about your brother?" She turned to face him. "No one asks the maid." It landed harder than anything he expected, and he had nothing to say in return. Because she was right. Back downstairs, Doris began gathering the used towels, already moving to clean. Dominic stopped her. "Leave it," he said. She hesitated, surprised. He didn't explain, just knelt beside the mess she'd made saving his children and quietly started folding one of the damp cloths himself. For once, he didn't need to lead, and for once, she let him follow. He walked her to the staff quarters, not because he had to, but because he couldn't bring himself to just let her vanish back into the background. At her door, she paused, hand on the knob. "Thank you," he said. She turned, gave him a tired smile. "I didn't do it for you." And still, he smiled back. "I know." That night, the house didn't feel like it was holding its breath. It felt still, not empty, not aching, just quiet, in a way that meant rest. Dominic sat on the edge of his bed, shirt half-buttoned, eyes unfocused. He wasn't thinking about numbers or meetings or who was due to call in the morning. He was thinking about how his sons had looked at her, and how, when things got dangerous, he'd looked at her the same way. For the first time in months, the house didn't feel like it was bracing for impact. No urgent calls to pediatricians, no slammed doors, no silence that screamed between footsteps. Just stillness. The kind that settles in after a storm, when everything is wet but untouched, and you don't know if it's safe to exhale yet. Doris didn't leave. Not right away. She told Dominic she'd stay just one more week, long enough to make sure the boys fully recovered. Her voice had been even, neutral. No expectation, no subtext. Dominic had nodded, but the look in his eyes said more than words ever could. That week, she moved through the house like breath, present, essential, unnoticed unless you stopped to feel it. She didn't hover, didn't overstep. But every night, just after the twins were tucked into bed, she returned to the nursery with the same quiet ritual. Chair pulled up, lights dimmed low. And then she sang. No words, just melody. A soft hymn hummed from memory, slow, circular, steady. The kind of tune that wraps around you without asking permission. Alan would nestle in, Adrian would grab at her fingers, and within minutes, sleep would find them. The first time Dominic heard her, he paused outside the nursery. Not intentionally. He was on his way to the office, papers in hand, routine in motion. But her voice caught him mid-step. He didn't move, didn't speak, just leaned against the doorframe, heartbeat slowing without permission. She never looked up, never acknowledged him. That made it easier to stay. The second night, he stood longer. No paperwork, no phone. Just a man in the hallway, listening like it hurt not to. He didn't even realize he'd been humming along under his breath until the melody drifted into silence. And he felt himself miss it. By the third night, he brought a chair from his office, placed it just outside the nursery door. He didn't sit. He just stood behind it, like it gave him an excuse to stay, like it made it okay to listen. Inside, Doris never broke rhythm. Her hands moved gently, adjusting blankets, brushing curls from tiny foreheads, pressing one last kiss to Adrian's crown before slipping away. Always in silence, always unseen. But Dominic was there, every night now. One evening, after the twins had settled and Doris stepped into the hallway, she caught him standing by the chair. Neither of them spoke at first. Then, softly, he said, "You sing like it's something you carry." Doris looked at him, surprised. "I do." He waited. "It's my grandmother's," she said. "She used to hum it when my brother was sick, said it made the night softer." Dominic nodded. "It does." There was something about the way he said it, like he'd only just remembered that nights could be softened. By the 5th day, the boys were laughing again, not the stunned giggles from the kitchen that first afternoon. Real laughter, the kind that echoed down hallways and made you stop mid-thought just to listen. Doris didn't chase it. She let them lead. Blocks on the floor, wooden spoons drumming on pots, little feet stomping to rhythms only they could hear. Dominic came downstairs one morning to find her in the living room with mixing bowls scattered across the rug, Alan banging a ladle like it was a drumstick. Adrian was already in full swing, chubby arms flailing to some made-up beat. And Doris, she was in the middle of it, laughing, not big or loud, but freely. Like for a second, she'd forgotten she was the maid. Dominic didn't announce himself. He just stood in the doorway and watched. Alan caught sight of him first, froze for a beat, then grinned, lifted the spoon high like a trophy. Adrian squealed. Doris turned, startled. Her hands paused mid-clap. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, already gathering bowls. "We were just—" He raised a hand. "Don't stop. You got him to laugh," Dominic added. His voice wasn't cold, it wasn't even tired. It was stunned. "He hasn't laughed like that with me, not once." Doris looked down at the spoon in her hand, then quietly said, "Sometimes they laugh when they feel safe, not when they're entertained." He didn't respond right away, he just nodded. And that nod, barely more than a breath, said, "More than thank you ever could." That evening, he brought his laptop into the hallway again, sat outside the nursery with the door open. The boys fell asleep faster this time, and when the music started, Dominic closed his laptop, set it on the chair, folded his hands, and just listened. He didn't know when the shift had happened. Maybe it started in the kitchen, maybe during the fever, maybe in the quiet afterward. But something had changed. He wasn't just tolerating her presence anymore, he was needing it. Not as staff, not as help, as something else. And Doris, she felt it too, in the way the twins reached for him now, not with desperation, but trust, in the way he looked at them while she sang, like he was finally seeing something that wasn't broken. And maybe in the way he looked at her, not quite ready, but no longer afraid. The house had found a rhythm. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't loud, but it was alive. Each morning the twins woke earlier. Each night they fell asleep faster. The crying lessened. The laughter lasted longer. And through it all Dominic watched, not as a boss, not even as a father, but as a man who was starting to notice things he'd never made time for before. The way Doris always knelt when speaking to the boys, eye level, never towering. The way she checked the temperature of their bottles against the inside of her wrist, never a thermometer, never a clock, just instinct. The way her voice never cracked, even when her hands trembled. And the way she always left the nursery door cracked open when she sang, like she knew someone was listening and didn't want to scare him off. It was a quiet Wednesday when Dominic found it. He wasn't looking for anything, just digging through the laundry closet for a spare crib sheet. He pulled open the wrong drawer, too fast. A stack of neatly folded towels tilted forward, and something slid out and landed softly on the floor. A photograph. He reached down without thinking, paused. It was Doris, younger, her hair longer, looser, freckles more pronounced. One arm wrapped around a boy in a wheelchair, maybe 10 years old, grinning so wide it made your heart hurt. His head leaned against hers like they were one story, written in 2 lines. Dominic stared at it longer than he meant to. Something tightened in his chest, the kind of ache that came with knowing you were seeing the edge of someone else's grief. Not reading about it, not hearing it, seeing it. He didn't put it back, not yet, just held it, and wondered how long she'd been carrying this inside her while scrubbing his floors. That evening the boys were especially attached to her. Alan didn't want to nap. Adrian followed her through every room. At dinner, she fed them sweet potatoes and told them softly, "Mama used to make this for Elijah." Dominic, seated nearby, almost responded, but stopped. He still hadn't asked her, still hadn't told her he'd seen the photo. And somehow, it felt wrong to bring it up now. Not because it didn't matter, but because it did, and he didn't want to reduce it to something he'd found. Later, he passed her in the hallway outside the nursery. She was holding a stack of folded baby clothes. She nodded, soft, like always. He stopped, opened his mouth, then closed it again. The words didn't come. Instead, he pointed toward the kitchen. "You want some tea?" She blinked once, the question clearly unexpected. But then she nodded. "Sure." They sat across from each other at the kitchen table, steam curled up between them. The boys were finally asleep. The house had gone still in that kind of nighttime hush that only exists when children aren't crying. Dominic glanced at her hands. No rings, short nails, one tiny scar near the thumb. Maybe from a burn. Maybe from a life no one asked her about. He wanted to ask, but not yet. Instead, he said, "You've been quiet today." Doris took a sip of her tea. "You've been watching today." He smirked. "Am I that obvious?" "You're not subtle." Silence again. Not awkward, not heavy, just there. Then he tried again. "Who was he?" She looked up slowly. He didn't mention the photo, didn't describe it, didn't explain. She didn't ask how he knew, just answered, "My brother." "Elijah?" She nodded. "Born early, weak lungs. Seizures started when he was 2. Doctors didn't think he'd live past 5. Dominic leaned in slightly. "He made it to 10, she said softly. "We fought for all of it." She didn't cry, but her voice dipped, low, steady, full of memory. "He used to hum that lullaby, the one I sing. Our grandma used to rock us both to it. I thought I'd forgotten the words. But the twins reminded me." Dominic exhaled slowly. He wanted to say something, anything, but nothing felt like enough, so he said only the truth. "I didn't know." "No one ever asks," she replied. There was no bitterness in her voice. That made it worse. The next morning she wasn't in the kitchen, not at breakfast, not during the boys' playtime. He found her folding towels in the laundry room, like always, except today her hands moved slower. Her face was turned slightly away. She didn't see him at first. Didn't see how long he stood there watching her with a look he hadn't worn since Lauren, half awe, half apology. He took a step forward, then stopped himself. Because now he understood something he hadn't before. Doris hadn't just cared for his sons. She'd carried something into his house that he had no name for, something forged in pain, made quiet by necessity, and offered without being asked. That night, he walked to the nursery with the chair again, sat just outside the door. The lullaby started. This time, when he heard the melody lift, he let his eyes close. Not to escape, but to feel it. Really feel it. And for the first time, the song didn't remind him of what was gone. It reminded him of what was here. The morning light poured through the east windows, soft and golden, warming the edges of the Wright estate like it had finally been invited in. The house didn't feel different. But he did. Dominic stirred his coffee slowly at the kitchen table, watching as Doris crossed the room with Adrian, balanced on one hip and a bowl of sliced bananas in the other. She wasn't trying to impress him. She wasn't trying at all. And that was the part he couldn't stop noticing. She just belonged, not as a fixture, as a presence. He finished his coffee, planned to leave the room, then heard something clang in the living room, metal against tile. He followed the sound, expecting a mess. Instead, he found the twins on the floor, surrounded by upside-down mixing bowls, banging wooden spoons like drums. The orchestra was chaotic, off-beat, glorious. And Doris, seated cross-legged between them, was keeping rhythm, hands tapping a plastic container, laughter low in her throat. "Encore," she whispered, tapping twice, then pausing. Alan squealed. Adrian clapped off beat. They were glowing. Dominic leaned against the doorway. He didn't speak. Didn't want to break whatever magic was happening. Adrian turned to Doris, let out a soft gasp of breath, and suddenly laughed. Not just a chuckle, not a giggle, a full-bodied, breathless belly laugh, the kind that shook his shoulders, the kind babies don't fake. Dominic froze. Then Alan joined in, slapping his spoon against the bowl with renewed energy, laughing so hard he toppled backward. It wasn't just sound, it was life. For a moment, Dominic didn't move, didn't even breathe. And then, something cracked, not in the room, inside him. He sat down slowly beside the chaos, legs folding beneath him on instinct, the rug brushing his slacks. Doris handed him a wooden spoon, wordlessly. He didn't take it, just watched as the twins giggled and climbed over her legs, drumming their joy into the floor. "I've tried everything," he said, more to himself than anyone else. "Music, toys, therapy. They never—" He trailed off. Doris looked at him gently. "Sometimes they don't laugh because they're amused." She brushed a curl from Adrian's forehead. "Sometimes they laugh because they finally feel safe." Dominic swallowed. Hard. He wanted to say something, anything, but his throat was too tight, so he just nodded, slowly, and watched them laugh. Later that afternoon, he stood by the window with a glass of water, watching the boys nap on the couch, one on Doris's lap, the other curled against a pillow. The sunlight moved across the floor like a second hand on a clock, and all he could think was, why does this feel like the first time I've seen my sons actually breathe? Doris hadn't said much since that morning. She'd gone about her tasks quietly, humming under her breath, moving through the house with the same rhythm as always. But Dominic moved differently now. He lingered, stayed in rooms longer than he meant to, walked into the kitchen and forgot why, listened for the sound of the boys' laughter, like it was the only evidence that any of this, life, healing, change, was real. That night, after the twins were asleep, he walked past the nursery. No chair tonight, no eavesdropping. He stood in the open doorway, watched as Doris smoothed Adrian's blanket, then kissed Alan's cheek and whispered something only he could hear. She turned, surprised to see him. Dominic didn't speak right away, just looked at the space she'd created, not the room, the calm, the peace, the safety. "You do more than clean," he said, his voice rough with honesty. Doris tilted her head. "So do you." He looked down, caught off guard. "I've been watching you," she added. "Not just this week, since the beginning." Dominic met her gaze, and for once, didn't look away. They stood there in the hallway. Neither moved. The kind of silence that doesn't demand to be filled. The kind that simply waits. Then Doris nodded once, past him in the hallway. And for the first time in a very long time, Dominic felt something settle inside him. Not grief, not guilt. Something warmer. Something that looked a little bit like hope. The next morning he found himself in the kitchen before anyone else. Made coffee, burned toast, laughed at himself. The sound surprised him, even more than the laughter in his sons' voices the day before, because his own had been missing longer. He stood in the center of the room, mug in hand, when Doris walked in with Alan on her hip. She stopped, said nothing, but the smallest smile tugged at the edge of her mouth. Dominic lifted the burned toast from the plate and held it up like a trophy. "Gourmet breakfast," he said, not taking orders. She shook her head, amused. "Your sons deserve better." He looked at Alan, who yawned and rubbed his eyes against her shoulder. "Yeah," Dominic said quietly. "They do." And for once he didn't mean just the toast. The email came in quietly. No subject line in bold, no flashing icon, just a line of text that had waited 2 years to arrive. "We're pleased to offer you a part-time placement in our early childhood education program." Doris read it twice, then again. She didn't smile, didn't cry. She just closed the laptop, let the cursor blink in the silence, then stood and folded laundry like she hadn't read a thing. She didn't tell Dominic, not that day, not the next. She kept moving through the house like always, measured, attentive, invisible in the ways people expected her to be. But something in her pace slowed. Her eyes lingered longer on the boys when they slept. Her hand brushed their backs just a moment longer when they laughed. And Dominic noticed. He couldn't say what had changed, only that something had. By Thursday, the twins had grown clingier. They followed Doris from room to room, dragging stuffed animals behind them, begging for stories, attention, closeness. They could sense it, even before he could. Dominic walked into the living room that afternoon with a report half read in his hand, only to find her seated on the rug with the boys, a stack of flashcards in her lap. "Red," she said, holding up a square. "Like the truck." Alan clapped. Adrian pointed at her shirt. She smiled. "Close." Dominic stood there longer than necessary, watching, listening, wondering if this was the last time he'd see her do this, and not knowing why that thought left his chest tight. That night, Doris stood over the sink washing bottles when she heard his voice behind her. "Something wrong?" She turned, startled. He was barefoot, hair still damp from his shower. He rarely came into the kitchen this late. She shook her head, rinsing the last bottle. "No, just tired." He leaned against the counter. "You've been quiet." "I'm always quiet." "Not like this." She dried her hands on the towel, folded it neatly. "You'd tell me if something was bothering you?" he asked. She hesitated. "I'd try," she said. He didn't push further. But neither of them left the room. Later, long after the boys were asleep, Doris stood at the foot of her bed, suitcase open on the mattress. Not packed, just open, just waiting. She stared at it like it might fill itself if she stayed still long enough. The acceptance email sat in her inbox. The first step toward a life she used to dream about. Teaching, learning, being seen for more than what she cleaned. But now, with Adrian's blanket still clutched in her hand and the sound of Alan's laugh echoing in her mind, it didn't feel like a dream. It felt like a betrayal. In his office, Dominic stood by the window, staring out at nothing. He didn't know what was wrong, but he knew the feeling. That itch of disconnection, the sense that someone was slipping through his fingers before he even knew how to ask them to stay. He turned toward his desk, looking for a distraction, and that's when he saw it. A crumpled paper in the trash, just barely visible beneath the corner of a torn envelope. He pulled it out. An application. Early Childhood Development Program. Applicant, Doris Thompson. His pulse slowed, then spiked. He sank into his chair, paper in hand. Not angry, not surprised, but scared. Scared of how much it suddenly mattered. Scared of how deep she had gotten into a space he never meant to open, and how little time he might have left to admit it. The next morning, he watched her move through the nursery with her usual grace, changing sheets, folding onesies, picking up the toys the twins had left behind. She didn't mention the suitcase. He didn't mention the application. But something had shifted between them, a silence neither one dared to name. At lunch, Adrian refused to eat unless Doris fed him. Alan threw his spoon, then immediately reached for her hand. She laughed softly. "They're a bit dramatic today." Dominic looked up from his phone. "They know something." "Like what?" He watched her closely. "Like maybe they're about to lose something they love." Her eyes flicked to his, then down to her plate. No reply. Just a silence that filled the room with everything they weren't saying. That evening, as the boys fell asleep to her lullaby, Dominic stood in the hallway again. He didn't bring the chair, didn't linger like a ghost. He stepped into the room. Doris looked up, surprised. "I'll take it from here," he said gently, reaching for Adrian's blanket. She hesitated, then nodded, handed it over. He tucked his son in, smoothed the blanket down, sat for a moment beside the crib. "I didn't know you wanted to teach," he said without looking at her. Her breath caught. "I used to," she said. "Before everything." "Why didn't you tell me?" "I didn't think it mattered." He looked at her then. "It matters." She stood in the doorway, unsure what to say next. So she said nothing, just gave him a long, quiet look, and left the door cracked open behind her. That night, Dominic sat by himself in the living room, fireplace glowing, glass untouched, and for the first time since Lauren's death he was afraid not of grief, but of being too late. The storm rolled in after midnight. Rain tapped against the windows like fingertips, too polite to knock, too persistent to ignore. Dominic stood at the upstairs landing, one hand resting on the banister, the other clenched loosely at his side. He didn't know why he'd come this far, but he was standing outside her door, Lauren's room, untouched since the funeral. Locked, not by key, but by fear. He turned the knob. It clicked, opened easily. The scent hit him first. Faint vanilla, something floral, faded now, but still clinging to the air like memory. The bed was still made, photos still on the dresser. A silk robe hung over the back of the chair like she might walk in and pick it up. Dominic stepped inside, not quickly, not reverently, just finally. He opened the top drawer of her vanity. Letters, dozens of them, all in her handwriting. Neat, familiar, alive. Each one labeled. For the boys. For your first birthday without me. If you ever remarry. And then, if I'm not here, and you can't feel anything. His fingers hovered over it. He didn't sit. He opened it standing chest tight, spine straight. Dom, I know you. I know the version of you who locks pain into neat corners and calls it strength. I know you'll try to outrun this by pretending you're the only one hurting. But you're not. Our boys need joy, not silence. They need to be held. They need to laugh, even if it's not with me. You are allowed to let someone in, even if she doesn't look like me, even if her voice isn't mine. You don't fail me by healing, you fail me by freezing. Dom, please, don't raise them in a museum of what we lost. Raise them in the warmth of what you still have. Let them love. Let them laugh. Let go. He didn't cry, not at first. He just stood there, the letter trembling in his hands until his legs gave out and the floor caught him. He stayed there a long time, hours maybe. Eventually he drifted into sleep with the letter resting against his chest like a second heartbeat. It was dawn when Doris found him. She hadn't meant to enter the room. She never did. But the door was open, the light was on, and the silence felt too heavy. She stepped inside, barefoot, cautious. Then she saw him, curled on the rug, back against the side of the bed, eyes closed. The letter barely held in his hand. She didn't speak, just knelt beside him, gently reaching to take the page before it crumpled under his weight. Her eyes scanned the words only long enough to understand what they were. She didn't need to read them all. She could feel it. Dominic stirred, eyes opened slowly. He looked at her, not startled, not embarrassed, just present. And in a voice that wasn't cold or commanding or closed off, he said one word. Stay. Not an order, not a plea, just truth. Doris didn't answer. She didn't need to. She just placed her hand over his and sat with him. No clock, no next step, just stillness. And for the first time he let someone witness him not holding it all together. Later that morning, Dominic didn't wear a suit. He made breakfast, terrible pancakes, burnt edges, too much syrup. The boys loved them. Alan threw blueberries at the wall. Adrian smeared syrup across his face like war paint. Doris laughed. Dominic laughed with her. Not because it was funny, because it was real. And real was finally enough. She stepped out back after breakfast, the boys tumbling around the yard with sticks and foam balls, inventing games only toddlers understand. Dominic followed, watched her as she sat on the porch steps, coffee in hand. I found the letter last night, he said. She nodded. I was never going to open that room. I know. I thought letting go meant forgetting her. Doris looked up. But it doesn't. He shook his head. No. It just means remembering her without shutting everyone else out. A long pause passed between them. Then he added, softer, I think she would have liked you. Doris smiled, but her eyes flickered down. Doesn't matter, she said. I'm not staying. He looked at her sharply. Why? I got accepted, she said quietly. The program I told you about. His stomach turned. That's great, he said, trying to mean it. She nodded. It is. Silence again. This time heavier. Will you go? He asked. I haven't decided. But you want to. I used to. He looked at her carefully. What about now? She didn't answer, just turned to look at the boys. Alan was chasing a leaf. Adrian had a stick in each hand like drumsticks, laughing at nothing. "They look for me now," she said. "Not just when they need something, they reach. They trust you. They love me." He didn't argue, because he knew it was true. He walked over and sat beside her, shoulder to shoulder. "You told me not to raise them in a museum," he said. She looked at him. "You listened." He nodded. "They deserve more than memory." She studied him for a long beat. And then, softly, like a breath breaking the surface, "So do you." The ceremony was a folding stage in the corner of a community center. Folding chairs, parents in cheap suits and proud eyes, a row of children waiting to receive paper certificates and possibility. Doris stood off stage, smoothing the hem of her dress with one hand, holding her graduation cap in the other. She hadn't worn a cap and gown in over a decade, didn't expect she ever would again. But here she was, and in the front row, flanked by two bouncing toddlers, sat Dominic Wright, suit and all. His tie was crooked, he hadn't noticed. Alan and Adrian were gripping poster board signs with marker-streaked letters. The spelling was off, the edges were wrinkled, but the message was loud and clear. "We love you, Mommy." The word hit her like sunlight, not because she wasn't expecting it, but because she'd been carrying it for months, in baby baths and lullabies and fevers, soothed in the dead of night. But this was the first time they'd said it out loud. She didn't cry. Not during the ceremony, not during the speech, not when her name was called and she stepped across that makeshift stage into a future she had almost abandoned. But when she stepped outside and saw them waiting, two boys who barely spoke 6 months ago, now running full speed toward her, arms wide. That's when her voice caught. She crouched down, caught them both, pulled them in, and let herself breathe in their chaos like it was oxygen. Dominic stood behind them, quiet, still, proud, and, maybe, a little scared. They drove home with the windows down. The boys sang nonsense in the back seat. Doris rode shotgun, certificate in her lap, gown folded neatly beside her. The house came into view slowly, golden in the late afternoon light. The same house that once felt like a mausoleum now looked soft, lived in, loved in. Later that night, the kitchen was warm with the smell of something sweet. Doris had insisted on baking something to celebrate. Alan was asleep on the couch. Adrian had fallen face first into a pile of coloring books. Dominic leaned against the counter, watching her move through the room like she always had, calm, steady, barefoot. And when she looked up and caught him staring, she didn't flinch. "You okay?" she asked. He nodded. "Yeah, I'm just thinking." "Dangerous," she teased. He smiled. "Yeah." Then quietly, "Sit with me." She wiped her hands on a dish towel, nodded. They sat at the kitchen table. No plates, no distractions, just the two of them, the house asleep around them, and the weight of everything unsaid, finally asking to be spoken. "I read that letter," he began. Doris looked at him. "I've read it every night since." He paused. "I think Lauren knew what she was asking when she wrote it. She knew I wouldn't want to let go, wouldn't know how." Doris didn't interrupt. He continued. "But you," he said, looking down at the wood grain beneath his fingertips. "You didn't just make them laugh again. You gave them back their childhood." He looked up. "You gave me back my sons." Her throat tightened. Still, she said nothing. "And you gave me something I didn't expect to feel again." He let that sit. Then he slid a plain manila envelope across the table. She hesitated. Inside, a paperwork, a letter of sponsorship, full tuition to continue her education, flexible hours, housing, everything, except a contract. "You're not staff," he said softly. "Not anymore." She blinked. "So, what am I?" Dominic took a slow breath. "I want you to stay," he said. "Not as the maid, not as a nanny, not even as the woman who saved us." She swallowed hard. "I want you to stay as family." The room went still, not like silence, like reverence, like something sacred had just been named. She closed the folder, met his eyes. Her voice was steady but full of more emotion than he'd ever heard from her. "I don't need your name, Mr. Wright." She reached for his hand. "I already have theirs." That night, the boys stirred just after midnight. Not cries, just restlessness. Doris walked into the nursery in her bare feet, wrapped in a sweater that smelled faintly of cinnamon and something older than grief. She knelt by the crib, rubbed Alan's back, brushed Adrian's curls away from his eyes, and then, softly, she sang, the same lullaby, low, steady, full of memory. From the hallway, Dominic listened. This time, he didn't stand in the dark. He walked in, sat beside her, and when the melody lifted into the final line, he joined her, quiet, uncertain, but there. Alan stirred. Adrian mumbled, "Again, Mama." Doris looked at them both, then at Dominic, then back at her boys, and whispered the only word she needed, "Always."